Well, good afternoon. My name is Jochum Wiersma, and this time I'm not going to talk about variety selection or nitrogen management in wheat, but I'm going to talk about climate weirdness or climate change. So, how do I get myself in trouble? Well, when I started my job, one of the things I found as I was orientating on my job was John Ence's publication that had been revised in 1995 that was named Potential Field Work Days During Planting and Harvesting. John Ance was the previous climatologist at North Dakota State University, and basically the godfather of the NDON system as we know it now. He actually had revised an earlier publication from Olson that came from 1969, where they looked at weather and what the profitable machinery size was to be able to get the work done within a season. Now, there's two graphs here. They're not clear because um, I don't have the original copies anymore. But the number of planting dates in the heart of the valley for 90% of the years is about 12. And there's about 20 harvest days available during the fall. That's what John Ance's conclusion was when they did the analysis. And after the 2019 harvest, the sugar beet harvest and wheat harvest, and um, last year's summer, I wondered if indeed those numbers still were holding true, or if climate change or climate cycles are making it harder for us to get our work done. So, what is climate weirdness? Well, climate, and I have to start out with a couple definitions. So, the weather that what we farm is basically the short term conditions in the atmosphere, is what you get. Climate is the average for an extended period of time at a certain location, what you would expect. So, whenever the weatherman talks about, the average minimum, the average maximum temperature for that particular day, that is actually the climatic data, and that's what you would expect at a location. Normally, that is calculated on 30-year running averages. That's called a climate normal. Now, within climate, anywhere in the northern US or anywhere else in the world, climate cycles. And those cycles are an expression of nested physical mechanisms that change the climate over time. And those are running in different time scales. Some are just a few years long, some are decades long, some are centuries long, and some are millennia long. Ice ages have alternated with warming periods from that last millennia um, for as long as we can go back in time. Now, the shorter cycles that most of us are familiar with are like the El Nino and El La Nina oscillation. It's called the ENSO oscillation. There's also the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which plays out basically in front of the coast of Alaska. And then there is the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, which plays in the northern Atlantic uh, from the Outer Banks over to Greenland. All those have actually influence on our climate and ultimately on our weather. So all those things still are going on. None of those have stopped. And so we see changes from year to year and from decade to decade, basically on depending on these cycles and where we are at those cycles. Now, climate change is a long-term change in the average weather patterns that goes basically above and beyond of those expected predicted from the climatic cycles. And if we look, for instance, at the long-term carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, expressed as parts per million, percentages basically, um, in just the last century, it has gone from just under 300, which was below the previous high concentration about 350,000 years ago, to now just over 400 parts per million. The scientific consensus is that that change is primarily driven by us, particularly the burning of fossil fuels. So with that, basically, what are the effects of that then on our climate? Well, for Minnesota, it means that we're going to be warmer. And those effects are going to be more pronounced on the T-min and T-max during the winter months. It's also has a larger effect on the minimum T of the daily T minimum during the summer. And that has to do with the next thing, which is weather conditions. But surprisingly, in all the climate projection models for Minnesota, the April and May months are going to be cooler compared to what they are now. Again, that has to do with the second thing that is happening, which is weather. We're going to have higher relative humidities, and those have basically water vapor holds a lot of energy. And because of that, we see warmer, especially warmer nights. Because we have those warmer nights, we don't have the excesses, and I should step back. Because those higher relative humidities, we also have a dampening actually of the T max. We're going to be on average warmer, but we're going to have not necessarily more days that are going to be extremely hot, aka above 100 degrees. Because we're wetter, those springs, especially winters and springs, are wetter, which explains why April and May tend to be cooler and wetter. But for the summer, and so after a cooler April, May, the temperatures rapidly then increase to a much warmer June and July with higher humidities, resulting in a higher incidence and severity of precipitation, what meteorologists call singularities, basically extreme thunderstorms. And those are thunderstorms that will dump 4+ inches in a single event. What that looks like basically is if we would go to parts of Iowa, Missouri, and eastern Kansas, that's what we're going to look like from northern Minnesota all the way to southern Minnesota. Just take the whole state and shove it down 500 miles to the south, and you get a pretty good idea of what our climate is going to look like. I don't know if you've ever been in St. Louis in the middle of the summer. I don't recommend it. It's not something that is very comfortable. Now, what are the growing season consequences? After all, we have air conditioning. We can make ourselves comfortable. Plants, unless you're in a greenhouse or a grow chamber, don't have that option. So with higher CO2 concentrations, as shown in that graph in the second slide, those CO2 concentrations are actually advantageous for plants, especially C3 plants. There's two forms of photosynthesis and how it's organized. Those are basically called C3 and C4 species. And the C3 species, soybeans are as an example, wheat is an example, sugar beets are an example, actually take have a greater advantage are benefited more by those higher CO2 concentrations, which will result in higher rates of photosynthesis. That is not necessarily the case for the C4 species like corn. It has to do with this phenomenon called photorespiration that basically once light intensities get too high, the plants start to thread water because it can't, not enough CO2 gets diffused in through the stomata into the plants. and the CO, oxygen that the plant produces starts to interfere with photosynthesis. Now, what is also predicted is a longer growing season that actually is weighted more towards the end. Those higher dew points, unfortunately, are more disadvantageous for cool season annuals like wheat compared to warm season annuals like soybeans and corn. And those really extreme weather events means that we're going to have higher risks of floodings and brownouts. So the predictions are that for wheat, initially we might see yield increases, and that's probably also true for sugar beets. But then we're reaching a point where the temperatures start to interfere too much and don't offset that advantage that the CO2 concentration gives us, and we start seeing declines in yield. So it's a mixed bag right now is what the predictions are. And that's all they are. They are predictions because you have to make a number of assumptions based on what we know from the physiology and where ultimately temperatures and precip patterns are going to be. So remember, I was just going like, well, we've had 2 really weird years. Let's see if we can compare that to what others have done. And so I went back to NAS Ag Statistics, which record days suitable for field work in their weekly crop progress reports during the season. Unfortunately, they started this in the mid 90s. They don't go back all the way into the 50s. I wish I had that data. And I did 2 things. I first did a regression of the average days recorded per week against the week, and I recorded that for each individual year from 1995 to 2020. And I took those numbers for each individual year and did a second regression analysis. And then you can start looking if there's a trend over years. So this is for the whole season. I'll try to explain this. So on average from 1995, 95 was kind of a year where we didn't have a very good year with only just maybe 4 days per week during the growing season for field work. And the growing season is the first week it's reported until the last week it's reported. And those seasons vary a little bit, probably 2 to 3 weeks at max between the shortest and the longest growing season. But then we had a whole bunch of years, 96, probably to 2003, where we're right around the average. From 2006 on to about 2013, it appears that we had a pretty good streak with more days per week on average that we could be in the field. 2010 was an exception, but since 2013, it looks like we're trending below. Now, if you look at this regression line, it wasn't actually statistical, so significant, meaning that on average across this time period of just 25 years, nothing really has changed, but there is a pattern in the data. Now that pattern comes more out in when you look at the noise in the data. That's a measure of that is residual mean square error, and I won't bore you with all the details, but of how this is calculated, you can call me afterwards and we can have a beautiful conversation over this. I like data, I'm sorry. But there's a downward slope, and we can see that in the latter years here, they're all below this trend line. And I'll come back to that. If you do this for just the spring, and you take the first 6 weeks, it actually looks like, and this was significant, a small increase in the number of days for field work. And there really isn't a pattern as far as the residual mean square error is going. If you do it at the fall, we actually see a decline. And again, if you look at the residual mean square error, it seems that after a couple of years kind of bouncing around, we're now trending all closer to that trend line. Okay, so rather than boring you with all these regression lines, what's the interpretation? And you can discuss me on this, but my interpretation of this is that the average number of days suitable for field work for the whole season has not changed over time. But there's a difference. In the spring, we're actually trending slightly up, while the number of days in the fall are trending slightly down, which would be unexpected based on current climate projections. The residual mean square error, however, is trending down for the whole season. What does that mean? That means that periods in which to complete the field work are on average getting shorter. We have a more rapid alternation of good stretches and bad stretches. So we get one shower running through that keeps us out of the field for a number of days. And then we have a couple of days to do field work again, and then we're off out of the field again. The RME in the spring was stable, but in the RME for the was sloping downwards in the fall. Again, that's unexpected because climate says that our falls are getting longer. So that means, okay, especially in the spring, we're not seeing what is predicted, but in the fall, things are getting tougher. So to me, that still means that, and this is where the title comes from, we have less time to cover more acres. Well, why? The early bird still gets the worm, especially for wheat, sugar beets, and corn in the spring. Planting date matters. We also have that the final quality of the harvested product matters for return per acre. A frozen sugar beet doesn't do us any good. A 4 pounds loss of test weight because it stood out there too long is a problem. Sprouting is a problem. So in the meantime, the average farm size in Northwest Minnesota has gone up from just over 1,000 acres to close to 2,000 acres in 2019, depending on in about a decade, depending on what statistics you use. Basically, farms are still getting bigger. So, how do we manage that more acres less time challenge? Well, we do it the same way we've always done it. Economies of scale. We get bigger equipment, we get faster equipment. But there is also another option. Maybe we need to partner for certain activities or crop enterprises. And then we do something that we've done always, but is counter to economies of scale. And we've seen more specialization in these as long as I've been here, where economies of scope, which is basically diversification, are counter to what we like to do. So economies of scale. What are economies of scale? Well, it's basically looking at, I want to produce something as cheap as possible. I want to have my fixed and variable cost at the bottom of this curve. And because then I'm utilizing that resource, that capital investment as best as I can. If you get equipment that's too big, eventually you have diseconomies of scale. So the bigger, better, faster has limits. On top of that, there is physical limits. A good example of that is combines. In Europe, the same combines that you use here can't get across the road because the roads are too narrow. That means that you can't get a bigger combine. You need to stay one model below, the smaller size that they have compared to here, which means you need to buy a second combine. So we are going to run into problems, with spray booms. 132 feet right now. 132 feet at 20 miles an hour is a lot when it comes to forces on that boom and them being able to, keep them level. There are going to be physical barriers to how big the equipment can be. The question then was, okay, if I look at wheat, what has happened? So I looked at the machinery cost in the FinBin data for Northwest Minnesota for rented land wheat, and I looked at the machinery cost as a percentage of the cost of production per acre. And you look that over that from 2000 to 2019, or from in the 20-year period, our cost as machinery, as a percentage of the cost of production acre for machinery has gone up. This is statistically significant. You are spending more money per acre on machinery as a percent of the total cost. The question, however, is it ultimately only matters if it also affects as a percentage of your price for the product that you receive. That means you're still on the bottom of that curve that I showed you. So here's the same machinery cost as a percentage of the price per bushel received. This doesn't include payments, government payments, and everything else. And this statistical analysis is not significant. In other words, you are making really good choices, at least those that have reported to Finbin, in that you are keeping, even though the cost per acre on machinery is going up, as a percentage of your cost of production, as price per bushel received, you're on the bottom of that scale, economies of scale um, curve, and so there isn't too much equipment out there. You are still able to harvest everything that you have with the machinery you have. You're not in that point where we have basically a loss of efficiency. Now, what are economies of scope? It's the opposite. In a way, is where we now say we're going to spread the cost of that piece of equipment across multiple enterprises. And guess what? You've done this for ages. But the desire and the drive is to actually uh, specialize and not have this diversification. But diversification, which is crop rotation for us, allows us to have that piece of equipment be used in different enterprises. And we do this every single time. And all of you do it. So, what are diversification partnering strategies in the case for us? Well, substitute part of the acres with crop enterprise that you have different planting and harvest windows. Spreading the workload. You do this every single time. But we are doing less of it. We don't grow as much barley. We don't necessarily have a lot of winter wheat acres or, and this is a little bit newer crop, hybrid rye. Those that produce alfalfa are very specialized, and those that don't do alfalfa are the majority. We don't see much buckwheat. We don't see much flax. Sunflower acres have gone down, but all those things allow that same equipment to be used. That's diversification. Now we can substitute party acres of time-sensitive crop enterprises with those that are less time-sensitive. And this helps us reduce those weather risks. Corn can stand out in the rain and the snow. Sunflowers can too. Dry beans cannot. Wheat cannot. We risk quality discounts if wheat stands out in the field too long. And so diversification that allows us to still harvest acres that we have in a timely manner, which is opposite of what some of us like to do, might be warranted as this weather gets weirder. And finally, substitute part of acres to a higher margin specialty variety or production system of an existing enterprise that you have. Why? Well, higher margins allow you to have a lower yield. And examples of that would be organic production or food grade soybeans. So, gave you a couple of strategies. This is quite a different talk from normal, but I will be trying to answer the questions in the live Q&A that follows now. Thank you.